Well, I'm very grateful to Barry for that introduction. In fact, I was enjoying it so much, I rather wish you'd keep it going a bit longer. Delighted to be here tonight at the Royal Overseas League. As you've heard, I spent some of my misspent career. I like to say that before I got into politics, I had a proper job. I spent some of my time there in Asia, and I worked in China. I was very interested by the list of countries, by the way. I would say I worked in Hong Kong and Singapore, but I really lived in the Philippines. There were lots of opportunities for living there. But the Chinese have an interesting saying: we should be grateful that we live in interesting times. And in my 17 years in the European Parliament, I don't think I've ever seen times as interesting as they are now. I had the pleasure in the last week of hearing Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker. He actually shook my hand after his speech. I have no idea why he did that, but he did. And Donald Tusk, who did not shake my hand. And also Jonathan Fall. Now, I don't know, he's a less familiar name than Juncker and Tusk, but Jonathan Fall is the British official with the Commission who is tasked with looking after matters related to Brexit. And it tells you all you need to know, I think, about Mr. Jonathan Fall when I tell you that he is unable to vote in the European referendum, thank heaven. And the reason he's unable to do that is because he has been abroad for more than 15 years. And I think he's acquired a little bit of the mindset. But he is the archetypal, quintessential Brussels bureaucrat, very clever, very good with words. And he was explaining Cameron's deal. And he was insisting that it was an unshakable deal. It is an agreement signed by all 28 member state governments. It has been, he said, and I believe David Cameron has said, deposited with the United Nations in Washington. So that proves everything, doesn't it? But I have to tell you, it is a deal made, quite simply, between 28 member state governments. And if you bear in mind that most of the European nations are more or less democratic, their governments change. A government that looks at it in 6 months' time or 12 months' time in Portugal, in Greece, in Croatia, may be a different government. It may take a different view. And also, of course, somebody may raise a challenge in the European Court of Justice. And as you will have seen from today's paper, and Michael Gove deserves, I think, a great deal of credit for what he has done. And David Cameron deserves a great deal of disapprobation for the attitude which he is taking to his friend and colleague, which I think is outrageous. The man tells the truth and he's threatened with being fired. He has said that the European Court of Justice can change it, or indeed turn it over completely if it wishes to do so. And that is the case. What has received a little bit less media coverage, but is nonetheless a fact, is that the European Parliament, in which I have the privilege of sitting, will be facing secondary legislation to implement parts of the deal. And I've got to tell you, there are lots and lots of MEPs who are unhappy with the deal, who don't like what you might call British exceptionalism, and who are passionate about workers' rights and what they see as discrimination. While I think it's likely that the European Parliament would vote through the appropriate legislation, I suspect it will be amended, and I wouldn't rule out the possibility that it is knocked over entirely. So you are not looking at a done deal, you are looking at a basket full of promises from Brussels. And frankly, anybody who votes for a basket full of promises from Brussels, I think needs their heads examining. Let me just take you through some of the issues. On some things that Cameron has brought forth, what is that wonderful Latin tagline about labouring mightily and bringing forth a mouse? I think that's what he's done. Some of the issues that he's so proud of, we actually had already. We have the right to remain outside the euro. Well, as I recall, John Major negotiated that in the Maastricht Treaty, so we've had that for a number of years. Then he's getting rid of the words ever closer union. But I have it from several people who understand these matters, including a very prominent German MEP called Elmar Brok, no relation, who is believed to be, as it were, the voice of Angela Merkel in the Parliament. He says, and he's obviously right, and other people have said it too, that the words ever closer union are just embroidery. They have no legal effect. And therefore, if you remove those three words, the removal of them has no legal effect either. So it's a little bit of cosmetic change, but it doesn't do anything. Then there are all the measures which are designed to protect the non-Euro states from the Euro states. These are very complicated and will be a field day for economists and lawyers, I suspect, for really rather a long time. But we know that the European institutions are past masters at bypassing any sort of little roadblocks they come across. So I don't see how the position that Cameron asserts is guaranteed can in fact be guaranteed. And of course all the welfare stuff, as I've just said, is conditional upon the views of the ECJ, the views of the European Parliament, and so on. Quite apart from the fact these red cards, the red card system is something that the European Union designs to reassure Eurosceptics, of whom there might be one or two in the room tonight, to make us, it's a bit like subsidiarity, you know, don't worry, we're into subsidiarity, decisions should be made at the lowest point, as near the people as they possibly can be. But no competence is ever handed back to member states, ever, it doesn't happen, and I'm afraid in these circumstances it won't be either. But okay, we can get a red card, we can get 55% of the member states to raise their concerns, and that is an achievement, because if we do that, the powers that be, the European Council, has to consider the reasoned objection. Consider. It is sufficient for them to write back saying, thank you for your communication, we have considered your reasoned objection and we don't agree with it. That is the end of it. It is not a power to stop anything, it has no real force, and in any case, the problem of getting 55% of member states to agree to do something, you simply can't invoke it, it isn't going to work. So Cameron's deal is nothing. And we know that in any case because, thank heavens, President Francois Hollande has told us so. We've given away nothing, he said. And I believe that Mr. Viktor Orban has said much the same thing. So although there's been great sound and fury, in fact, Cameron has achieved nothing at all. But I think there is a benefit with this deal, and I'll tell you what it is. I think, roughly speaking, you can divide the British population in their views on this question. Roughly, 1/3 would vote to come out anyway, 1/3 would vote to stay in anyway, and the third in the middle are kind of waiting to be persuaded, waiting for information. And those people in the middle are going to look at the Cameron package and say, well, I wasn't sure which way I ought to vote, but frankly, if that's the best Cameron can get, and if that's the degree of contempt in which we are held by the European institutions, then maybe we'd better get out of it. Actually, I think there's going to be another group of people. There's a letter in the Telegraph today saying, can I buy a device to attach to my television to turn it off whenever the word referendum is mentioned? Already with 4 months to go, we're hearing people saying, I've heard enough of this, can't we talk about something else? So I'm rather hoping that there'll be a significant tranche of the population who will say, we've heard so much about this damn thing, let's just get it out of the way and vote to leave. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I suspect it may possibly occur. Then Cameron's spinning of this thing has been extraordinary. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in politics. They announced that they're going to get 80 chief executives of FTSE companies to sign a letter saying we should stay in. And then they find they can only get 36. So the story is not 36 signed, the story is 64, I did have a maths degree, as you rightly said, 64 of the 100 didn't sign. And the very next day we get the generals. And we get this lovely letter from the generals saying we need the security of Europe around us. Oh no, sorry, that was the strength of the insurance companies, wasn't it? But the day after, who do we get but General Sir Michael Rose saying, I never agreed to do that, and what's more, I don't agree, and I think we're better off out. And then today, we get Lord Bramall saying, well, I was very reluctant to sign this thing, and I only signed it because it was presented to me as though I had to and everybody else had, but actually I don't agree with it. I mean, as a PR disaster, you could hardly do better. Nonetheless, the Remain campaign is a formidable beast, and it is engaged in what we might call Project Fear, or what I like to call the Nightmare on Downing Street, which will be coming somewhere near you shortly. And I'd like just to run through, sorry, you must tell me, Chairman, if I'm going on too long, just run through some of the issues that they will be using. 3.5 million jobs at risk. Now, we've heard this for the last 15 years. It comes from the National Institute of Social and Economic Research, a paper they did in the year 2000. They said that 3.5 million jobs in Britain depend upon trade with the EU. And they may well be right, for all I know. I think it's probably a very reasonable figure. But let me stress, they said on trade, not on membership. And they actually went on explicitly in that report to say there is no prima facie reason to suppose that if we leave the European Union, the trade will cease. And of course, there are very strong reasons why it won't cease. And I'll give you 3 reasons why it won't cease. Reason number 1, under WTO rules, I hope I'm not infringing on Professor Minford's area here. Under WTO rules, they simply are unable to apply punitive taxes and duties on us, even if they wanted to. The second thing is, we shall almost certainly leave under the provisions of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, the 2-year process during which we negotiate a new relationship if we want it, which I think can be no more than a free trade relationship. And that requires I like this phrase, the rump EU, as I like to call it, the remainder that's left after Britain has gone. That requires them to establish favourable trading relationships with neighbouring countries. So they're tied by that. But the third and most important reason, as we all know, and I'll just mention it for completeness, as you know, Britain is the largest or will be the largest external customer of the remains of the European Union, bar none, bigger than America, bigger than any other country. We are their biggest single customer in the world. And thanks to the enormous trade deficit we're running with them, you maybe have a more up-to-date figure of 60 billion, I think, or something like that, an enormous trade deficit. We're not only the biggest customer, we're the biggest net customer. So frankly, if 1 or 2 firebrands in the Commission decide they want to punish Britain for leaving, I tell you what will happen. They will have the chief executives of Mercedes and BMW and Audi and Renault and Citroën kicking their doors down and demanding a free trade agreement. Digby Jones, who was Director General of the CBI and was an advisor to the trade advisor to the Labour government, is on record as saying, when we leave I think he said if we leave the European Union, we will have a free trade deal within 24 hours. Now, 24 hours will be pushing it, but we will certainly have it during the course of that renegotiation. The next thing, and it's a sort of related thing, we've heard a lot from the Engineering Employers Federation, who generally are good people, and I've dealt with them for a long time. But they have come out and said, no, we must stay in the European Union. It would be foolish to cut ourselves off from our largest market. And if I can put in a quick commercial here, I wrote a blog about that a couple of days ago. Do look it up if you want a bit more detail. But the point is this, cutting ourselves off. In what respect will we have cut ourselves off? You may be aware that the 3 largest external suppliers of goods into the European Union, 3 largest countries in terms of external suppliers, are Russia, China, and the United States of America. Obviously, by definition, they are not members of the single market, but I have to tell you that nor do they have any kind of favourable trading terms. They just trade on arm's length trading terms, and yet they are the biggest suppliers of goods into the European Union. The European Union has free trade agreements with many countries around the world. I think particularly of South Korea, because I worked there for a long time. One of the things we must look out for in this debate, they come again and again and say, well, if you leave, you'll be like Norway or Switzerland. You'll still be subject to the rules, you'll get regulation by fax, you'll have to pay a lot of money in order to have access to the single market, and you'll still be subject to rules that you have no voice in creating. I've got to tell you, we've got pretty damn little voice in creating the rules at the moment. Never mind. They always come back to those 2 examples because they're very bad examples. And that is the reason why we will not be like Norway and Switzerland. Don't compare us with 2 little peripheral countries to Europe, which are quasi-associate members of the European Union. Compare us to any other G7 economy, which is an independent nation. Compare us to America or to Canada or to South Korea, if you want. Those are countries which trade with the European Union. In the case of South Korea, they have a free trade agreement. In the case of Canada and America, they are negotiating trade deals. But the fact is, they do not have free movement. They are not subject to the European Union rules. They do not pay for market access. They simply trade on an arm's length basis. That's what we shall do, except I am absolutely sure we shall have a free trade agreement as well. Nevertheless, they tell us we should be isolated and marginalised. Isolated and marginalised. We have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. We're a member of the G7, the G20, the WTO, the World Bank, the OSCE, the OECD, the Commonwealth. We're an important player in NATO, and we'll come to security in a minute. We are one of the most globally connected and engaged countries in the world, in addition to being a great global trading nation. the idea that we become isolated and marginalized because we decline to be governed by foreign institutions in foreign countries is absolutely preposterous. But let us turn straight to the question of security, because this is something the Prime Minister is making a great deal of. We need to stay in for security. Well, think about that for a little while. And I loved the comment that one of the generals who declined to sign the government's letter actually said, so far as he was concerned, security was tied to sovereignty and the European Union was eroding our sovereignty. There are two things we need for our security. Well, there are many things we need for our security, but two critical things we need for the security of this country. The first is membership of NATO, and we are a major player in NATO. The second is to control our borders. If we can't control our borders, we cannot protect ourselves against the asymmetric threats of terrorism and ISIS and all those people. The head of the police service in Europe tells us there are 5,000 or 6,000 jihadists who've been injected into Europe along with all the migrants that we've seen. He may be right, he may be wrong, but ISIS is also telling us that they're sending in jihadists under the cover of this great migration. If we accept large numbers of immigrants and we are unable to check their bona fides, we will find terrorists on the street of this country, and the sort of things that happened in Paris will be happening here. So we must maintain our security by controlling our borders, and we cannot control our borders until we get out of the European Union. Then again, this is going to be a leap in the dark. As though being an independent nation was something curious that we couldn't understand, rather than the normal state of most countries most of the time. I love the quotation from Lord Lawson on this. He says, people ask me, he says, what is our alternative to membership of the European Union? That is the most stupid question, says Lord Lawson. It is obvious. The alternative to membership of the European Union is not being a member of the European Union, which, he said, is the state of most countries in the world, and most countries in the world are doing economically better than the European Union is. And that seems to me absolutely to kill the argument. But I tell you what the leap in the dark is. The leap in the dark is staying in a European Union which is in crisis, which is unable to control its borders, which has its own currency in a state of terminal disaster. And look at the situation across southern Europe. But it's also a European Union where there are 1 million migrants in Germany, and how long is it going to be before Angela Merkel decides to give passports to those million and they come and live on a street near you? And in order to engage the assistance of Turkey in controlling the migrant flow, the powers that be in Brussels have decided to accelerate the Turkish application for membership. Turkey will be the largest country if and when they join. They will be the poorest country in per capita terms as and when they join. And there will be 75 million of them who are welcome to come to any other European country, and I suspect rather a lot of them will want to come to Britain. So the leap in the dark is staying in this dysfunctional and declining European Union. That is what we should be concerned about. Very briefly, the sterling hit. You know, we've seen the sterling go down on the very rumour of Brexit, merely because we've got a date and we've got Boris Johnson. Suddenly the pound goes down. And what I would say to you is this. First of all, of course there will be a period of turbulence, especially when HSBC and Goldman Sachs are going around saying Brexit will be a disaster for the British economy. They are talking it down. They are the people who are creating the problem. But I tell you another thing. All across the world, central banks are looking at ways of reducing the value of their currency on a competitive devaluation basis. The point is they can't do it because interest rates are so low, and the primary tool for reducing the value of your currency is actually to reduce interest rates, and broadly speaking, they can't. There was a piece by Jeremy Warner in yesterday's Telegraph. He said perhaps a minor sterling crisis is just what the doctor ordered. I'm not urging it, but I'm saying there are potential upsides as well as potential downsides. The other thing I hear that I must mention, I was on a platform, believe it or not, with a Liberal Democrat, and he stood there and he said, of course, within the European Union we can make trade deals. If we leave, we are far too small a country to make our own trade deals. Let me tell you, Switzerland, population about 7 million, has its own trade deal with China. Iceland, with a population of about 350,000, like a sort of medium British city, has its own trade deal with China. We don't. And what's more, we can't negotiate one because we're in the European Union and we're not allowed to. Only Brussels can negotiate it for us. The other thing, which is the point I made to the Liberal on the platform, is that if you look at America, he was being specific about America. You can't do a trade deal with America, you're too small. America has trade deals with 20 independent nations, and every one of those independent nations has a smaller economy than Britain. So don't tell me that we're too small to make our own trade deal with America. Maybe too big, but we're certainly not too small. I've tried to cover a lot of the negatives that the other side will be bringing up, but I think I'll conclude just by saying a few words about the positive opportunity for Britain as we, and I love that headline, out of the European Union into the world. That's the alternative. There's a great big world out there, and there is growth in that world as there isn't in the European Union. What will we have? We will have deregulation. On my specialist subject of energy, we could potentially, if we had the sense to do it, and cancel the Climate Change Act, we could potentially have much cheaper energy. And there's a whole story there about how we're driving energy-intensive businesses offshore. We can have global trade opportunities that are simply not open to us at the moment. So there are very, very positive prospects for the European economy, for the British economy outside Europe. And I personally believe that when we've been out for 5 years, we will find there are other EU member states who are keen to follow us. But the last point, it's not all about economics. It's about democracy, it's about freedom, it's about who we are, it's about whether we govern ourselves or not, it's about whether we stand up and stand tall in the world, whether we think that a country which is in the G7, fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it, do we think that a country that size is capable of governing itself? Of course it is. I believe that the British people have the right and the ability and the duty and the manifest destiny to govern themselves in a democratic and independent state. And what I say is, roll on Independence Day, June 23rd. Thank you.